Black Hills, Dakota Territory, 1883. The craggy buttes of Dakota Territory were all that stood between a man and heaven, or so it seemed to Blake Oberfield as he surveyed the endless stretch of prairie from atop his chestnut quarter horse. At 26, Blake had spent more time on horseback than most men twice his age, but the weight pressing on his shoulders had nothing to do with physical exertion. He adjusted his Stetson, shielding piercing blue eyes from the harsh midday sun as his gaze swept across the rolling landscape. His lean, muscular frame had been hardened by years of driving cattle across unforgiving terrain, yet beneath that strength lay a truth he'd never admit aloud. The frontier had taken more from him than it had given. "The West is no place for putting down roots," Blake muttered to his horse, the words a familiar mantra. "Man who gets attached out here is just asking for heartache." He'd seen too many good men buried in unmarked graves, too many widows left to fend for themselves in a land that showed no mercy. His own parents had succumbed to frontier fever when he was 15, leaving him to make his way alone in a world that rewarded self-reliance above all else. He'd learned to trust his horse, his Colt revolver, and little else. Blake had convinced himself that the life of a drifting cowhand suited him just fine, taking work where he could find it, moving on when the seasons changed, avoiding the complications that came with settling in one place too long. The small town of Riversbend came into view as Blake crested the final ridge before the descent into the valley. Nestled against the bank of a meandering river, it was larger than many of the settlements he'd passed through, boasting a proper main street with a hotel, general store, and even a schoolhouse. The railroad had reached it 2 years prior, bringing with it the first hints of civilization. Blake had accepted a job offer from the owner of the Circle S ranch outside of town, promising himself it would be temporary, just long enough to build up his stake before moving on to Montana Territory. As Blake rode down the dusty main street, the town seemed to be holding its breath in the afternoon heat. A few horses stood hitched outside the general store, tails swishing lazily at flies. The saloon was quiet this early in the day. He was about to continue straight through to the ranch when something caught his eye that made him pull his horse up short. Behind the weathered clapboard church at the edge of town, a young woman knelt in the dirt. Her dark blue calico dress pooled around her as she leaned forward, offering something to what appeared to be 3 mangy, half-wild dogs. Her honey-blonde hair was partially contained in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to catch the sunlight. Blake couldn't make out her features clearly from this distance, but there was something about her posture, a gentleness combined with quiet determination, that held his attention longer than he'd intended. What sort of woman would waste precious food on strays in a land where each meal was earned through hard work? It seemed foolish, yet he couldn't deny the strange tightness in his chest as he watched her speak softly to the creatures, who approached her with the caution of animals accustomed to kicks rather than kindness. Shaking his head, Blake clicked his tongue and urged his horse forward. He had a job to do, and getting distracted by some soft-hearted woman feeding mutts would only prove his point about attachments being dangerous in a place where survival demanded a practical mind and a hardened heart. Tessa Grayson had long since stopped caring what the townsfolk thought about her habit of feeding the stray dogs that roamed the outskirts of Riversbend. At 22 years old, she had weathered enough disapproving looks and whispered comments to last a lifetime. "There now," she murmured, offering a scrap of dried beef to the newest addition to her unofficial pack, a skittish hound with one torn ear and ribs that showed through his dull coat. "No one's going to hurt you here." The dog inched forward, nostrils flaring as he assessed the offering. His companions, more familiar with Tessa's kindness, had already claimed their portions and stood nearby, watching with alert eyes. The new dog snatched the meat and retreated several paces before devouring it, his gaze never leaving her face. "Miss Grayson," the sharp voice of Mrs. Whitfield, the minister's wife, cut through the peaceful moment. "I must insist you stop encouraging those filthy beasts to linger near the church grounds. They frightened little Emma Peterson just yesterday, and Reverend Whitfield nearly tripped over one this morning." Tessa rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirt with dignity. At her full height she stood straight-backed and composed, meeting the older woman's disapproval with calm green eyes. "They're God's creatures too, Mrs. Whitfield," Tessa replied, her voice soft but firm. "And they wouldn't frighten anyone if people didn't treat them as though they were wolves, rather than abandoned dogs. Your father would be mortified by this behavior, Mrs." Whitfield sniffed, delivering what she clearly believed to be her most devastating blow. The mention of her father stung, as it always did, but Tessa had long since learned to hide such reactions. Judge William Grayson had been a respected figure in the Dakota Territory until his death 3 years prior, leaving Tessa alone except for her older brother Thomas, who had promptly departed for California after settling their father's affairs. "My father taught me that compassion isn't wasted, even on those others consider worthless," Tessa countered. She gathered her basket, nodded politely to the fuming woman, and walked with measured steps toward the general store where she worked 6 days a week. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Whitfield mutter something about unmarried women with too much time and not enough sense. The words weren't meant to be overheard, but they followed Tessa like a shadow as she made her way down the street. Working at Harrington's general store provided Tessa with a modest living and the small mercy of a room above the shop. Mr. Harrington had been her father's friend, and while the arrangement began as charity, Tessa had proven herself indispensable through careful bookkeeping and a gentle way with customers that even the gruffest ranchers responded to. As she approached the store, Tessa noticed a chestnut horse she didn't recognize hitched outside. A new arrival in Riversbend was always a matter of interest, but she put the thought aside as she entered through the back door to prepare for the afternoon rush of customers that typically followed the midday heat. By the time Blake arrived at the Circle S ranch, the sun had begun its westward descent. Joseph Sanders, a white-haired man with a face weathered like old leather, greeted him with a firm handshake and an appraising look. "Oberfield, is it? Hank Miller spoke highly of your work on his drive last season. Said you've got a way with horses that borders on unnatural," the ranch owner remarked, leading Blake toward the bunkhouse. "Horses make more sense than most people," Blake replied, then immediately regretted the surly tone. This was, after all, his new employer. "What I mean is, I've spent enough time with them to know their ways." Sanders chuckled. "No need to pretty it up for me, son. I've been around long enough to prefer the company of my livestock to half the folks in town myself." The bunkhouse was clean and sturdy, housing 6 other men who would be Blake's companions for the coming months. They were a typical collection of ranch hands, varying in age and background, but united by the common language of cattle, horses, and the unwritten code of the West. Blake stowed his meager possessions on an empty bunk, established his place in the rough hierarchy through careful observation, and by supper time had been accepted with the minimal conversation men of his profession typically required. Later that evening, as the ranch hands relaxed after their meal, conversation turned to the town of Riversbend. "You'll want to visit Harrington's store," advised a weathered cowhand named Pete. "Old man Harrington's prices are fair, and they've got the best selection this side of Deadwood. And Miss Grayson," added a younger hand named Charlie with a suggestive grin, "is easy on the eyes in a way that makes a man want to shop for things he don't even need." "Miss Grayson?" Blake asked, the image of the woman feeding strays flashing in his mind before he could suppress it. "Judge Grayson's daughter," Pete explained. "Been running the books at Harrington since her pa died. Pretty as a picture, but," he lowered his voice, "got some peculiar ideas about animals. Feeds every stray dog, takes in injured birds. Some folks think she's touched in the head, but she's sharp as a tack with figures and remembers every customer's preferences." Blake kept his expression neutral. "Sounds like a waste of good food to me." "That's what most say," Charlie agreed. "But if you ever saw her smile when one of those mongrels finally trusts her enough to eat from her hand," he shook his head with a faraway look, "makes a man think twice about what's worth caring for." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Blake found himself returning to the image of the woman kneeling in the dirt, offering kindness where others saw only worthlessness. It reminded him uncomfortably of his mother, who had once rescued a half-frozen wolf pup against his father's protests, only to have it grow into their most loyal protector. Such softness had no place on the frontier. It was a luxury that death and hardship quickly stripped away, leaving only the practical necessity of survival. Blake had learned that lesson the hard way, watching his mother's gentle nature crumble under the weight of loss and isolation before fever took both his parents in the same merciless week. He rolled onto his side in the narrow bunk, pushing away memories that served no purpose. Tomorrow would bring work, good, honest work that left no room for contemplating green-eyed shopkeepers or stray dogs or the strange hollow feeling that had taken residence in his chest years ago. Tessa's life followed a pattern as predictable as the changing seasons. 6 days a week, she rose before dawn to prepare the store, managed the accounts while Mr. Harrington handled the customers, ate a simple midday meal at her desk, and closed up shop as the sun descended. Sunday mornings were reserved for church, despite Mrs. Whitfield's disapproving glances, and Sunday afternoons were her own to spend tending her small garden behind the store or reading one of the precious books she'd inherited from her father. Into this carefully ordered existence walked Blake Oberfield on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, bringing with him the indefinable scent of open prairie and leather that seemed to cling to all cowboys, yet somehow affected her more powerfully than usual. The store bell jangled as he entered, drawing Tessa's attention from the ledger where she'd been recording the morning's transactions. Her first impression was of height and controlled strength, broad shoulders beneath a faded blue shirt, dark hair in need of a trim curling slightly at the collar, and a clean-shaven jaw that spoke of recent efforts at civilization despite the frontier setting. When he removed his hat, revealing eyes the exact shade of a summer sky, Tessa felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach that she quickly attributed to having skipped breakfast. "Good afternoon," she greeted him with the same polite smile she offered all customers. "Is there something specific you're looking for today?" Blake had rehearsed a list of supplies in his mind on the ride into town: tobacco, writing paper, gun oil, but found himself momentarily at a loss for words when confronted with her direct gaze. The woman from behind the church was even more striking up close, with clear green eyes that seemed to look straight through a man's carefully constructed defenses. "Just restocking some essentials," he managed, his voice sounding unnaturally gruff to his own ears. "New hand at the Circle S." Tessa nodded, moving from behind the counter to help him locate his items. "Mr. Sanders runs a good operation. Most of his men stay on for years once they sign on." The unspoken question hung in the air. Would he be one of those who stayed? "I go where the work takes me," Blake replied, the practiced response coming easily. Never been one for putting down roots. Something flickered across her expression. Not judgment exactly, but a quiet assessment that made Blake feel as though she was cataloging more than just his supply needs. "The West seems to attract those who prefer movement to stillness," she observed, reaching up to retrieve a tin of gun oil from a high shelf. "Though I've noticed even the most determined drifters sometimes find reasons to linger." As she stretched, Blake caught sight of a pale scar that traced from her wrist up her forearm, partially visible where her sleeve had pulled back. It was an old injury, the kind that came from a serious burn rather than a momentary mishap. His eyes darted away when she turned back toward him, not wanting to be caught staring at something she might prefer to keep private. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the tin, and Blake was startled by the warmth that spread from that brief contact. He found himself searching for something else to say, some reason to prolong the interaction, but his mind remained stubbornly blank. "Will that be all, mister?" She left the question hanging. "Oberfield, Blake Oberfield," he cleared his throat, "and yes, that's all for today." As Tessa tallied his purchases, the store door opened again, admitting a gray-haired woman whose pinched expression suggested perpetual disapproval. Upon seeing Tessa, the woman's lips tightened further. "Miss Grayson, I've just learned from my husband that you've been leaving scraps behind the church again, despite our explicit request that you cease encouraging those dangerous animals near our congregation." Tessa's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained level. "Mrs. Whitfield, I assure you I've been very careful to leave nothing that would attract the dogs near the church itself. If they're lingering, it's because they're looking for me, not because of any food. That distinction hardly matters when little children are being frightened on their way to Sunday school, Mrs. Whitfield countered. The Reverend and I have decided that if this continues, we'll have no choice but to speak with the town council about requiring all stray dogs to be shot on sight. Blake watched as Tessa's composed expression faltered for just a moment before she regained control. The threat had struck home in a way that clearly pained her, yet she responded with dignity rather than the emotional outburst most would expect. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Whitfield," she said carefully. "Perhaps we could discuss a compromise. I've been thinking of building a small shelter behind my garden where the dogs could be contained and properly cared for until suitable homes might be found." Mrs. Whitfield scoffed. "And who would want to adopt these wild creatures?" "Really, Miss Grayson, your father may have indulged these fanciful notions of yours, but at some point you must accept the realities of frontier life. Resources are precious, and wasting them on animals that serve no purpose is the height of impractical sentiment." Blake found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "Working dogs are the most valuable hands on any ranch, ma'am." Both women turned to him with surprise. "A good dog can do the work of 3 men when it comes to herding cattle." Mrs. Whitfield looked him up and down with open suspicion. "And you are?" "Blake Oberfield, ma'am." New hand at the Circle S, he nodded respectfully, despite the sudden urge to defend Tessa from this woman's cold assessment. "I've seen half-wild dogs become the best working animals with the right handling. Many ranchers would pay good money for a dog with natural instincts, properly trained." The older woman seemed taken aback by his unexpected intervention. She pursed her lips, clearly recalculating her approach. "Well, Mr. Oberfield, while your expertise with livestock is no doubt considerable, these particular animals have been nothing but a nuisance to our community. Good day to you both." With that, she selected a small tin of tea and departed, leaving a strained silence in her wake. Tessa turned to Blake with genuine curiosity in her eyes. "Why did you say that?" "About the dogs, I mean." Blake shifted uncomfortably, already regretting his impulsive defense. "Just stating facts, ma'am. A good dog is worth its weight in gold on a ranch." He reached for his purchases, suddenly eager to escape the intensity of her gaze. "How much do I owe you for these?" Tessa named the amount, studying him as he counted out the coins. When he turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Thank you, Mr. Oberfield. Whether you meant to or not, you may have just saved some innocent lives." Blake nodded awkwardly, settling his hat back on his head before stepping out into the afternoon sunlight. Only when he was halfway back to the ranch did he realize he'd forgotten to buy the tobacco he'd originally come for, providing an unwelcome excuse to return to Harrington's store and its green-eyed bookkeeper sooner than he'd planned. Over the following weeks, Blake found himself inventing reasons to visit town: a torn shirt that needed mending thread, a sudden need for peppermint candy, a letter to mail to a former employer who didn't exist. Each time, he told himself, it was merely convenient to stop at the general store while in town for legitimate business. Yet each visit inevitably coincided with the hours when Tessa Grayson would be behind the counter, rather than Mr. Harrington. Their conversations remained brief, polite, but Blake began to notice the way her eyes brightened when he entered, how she seemed to find small ways to prolong their interactions, showing him a new shipment of pocket knives, or asking his opinion on the quality of a recently arrived saddle blanket. In turn, he found himself offering information he rarely shared. Stories of cattle drives through Montana, the best way to predict storms on the open prairie, how his mother had taught him to identify edible plants when game was scarce. These were not the carefully guarded confidences of his deeper self, but they represented more than he'd willingly offered anyone in years. One afternoon in early June, Blake arrived at the store to find Tessa struggling with a heavy crate of canned goods. Without thinking, he stepped behind the counter, a space usually reserved for employees, and lifted it easily. "Where would you like this?" he asked, ignoring the way her proximity made his heart race like a green bronc. Tessa looked startled, then grateful. "In the storeroom, please. Mr. Harrington's nephew usually helps with the heavy deliveries, but he's down with a summer fever. Blake followed her through a narrow doorway into a well-organized storeroom, where he set the crate down among similar containers. "Thank you," Tessa said, pushing a stray lock of honey-blonde hair behind her ear. "I was about to attempt moving it myself, inch by inch." Blake noticed several more crates waiting to be stowed. "I can handle the rest of these if you'd like." Her smile lit something inside him that he'd thought long extinguished. "That would be tremendously helpful. Mr. Harrington gave me the afternoon off once the delivery was properly stored, and I was hoping to have enough daylight left to work on a project behind the store." "The dog shelter?" Blake asked before he could stop himself, revealing that he'd remembered their conversation from weeks before. A flash of surprise crossed her features, followed by pleasure at his recollection. "Yes, actually. I've been gathering materials bit by bit, but I'm afraid my carpentry skills leave much to be desired." Blake hesitated, knowing he was about to cross a line he'd carefully maintained. Helping with store deliveries was one thing, a simple courtesy any man might extend. Offering to build a shelter for stray dogs was quite another, revealing an investment in her interests that went beyond casual acquaintance. "I could take a look if you'd like," he offered, keeping his tone casual. "I'm handy enough with basic construction." The brilliant smile that transformed her face made his momentary discomfort worthwhile. "Would you really?" "That would be wonderful, Mr. Oberfield." "Blake," he corrected, suddenly tired of the formality between them. "If I'm going to be building dog houses, you might as well use my given name." She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Blake then, and you must call me Tessa." The simple exchange felt more intimate than it should have, creating a small bubble of connection in the dusty storeroom. Blake broke the moment by turning to the remaining crates, focusing on the familiar physical exertion rather than the unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. An hour later, with the deliveries properly stored and the store closed for the afternoon, Blake found himself in the small yard behind Harrington's. A neat vegetable garden occupied one corner, while the rest of the space contained a modest collection of lumber, chicken wire, and tools that Tessa had gathered for her project. "It's not much," she admitted, gesturing to the materials. "Mr. Peterson at the lumberyard has been kind enough to set aside odd pieces, and Sheriff Collins donated the wire from an old chicken coop he tore down." Blake surveyed the available supplies with a practiced eye, mentally calculating what could be constructed with them. "You could build a decent shelter for 3 or 4 dogs with this," he observed, crouching to examine a length of lumber. "Especially if we use that back corner where the fence meets the building." Tessa knelt beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent that clung to her hair. "That's exactly what I was thinking. It would provide additional protection from the wind." As they worked together through the afternoon, Blake found himself increasingly drawn to the quiet determination that drove this woman. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, following his instructions carefully and asking intelligent questions about the construction process. When they paused for water, she described her vision not just for sheltering the dogs, but potentially training them as working animals, exactly as he had suggested to Mrs. Whitfield. "I've always believed that every creature deserves a chance to prove its worth," she explained, wiping perspiration from her brow with the back of her hand. "These dogs aren't vicious by nature, they're simply survivors in a harsh environment, much like the rest of us." Blake hammered a nail with more force than necessary, unwilling to acknowledge how deeply her words resonated with him. "Most folks around here see them as nothing but nuisances and threats," he observed, keeping his tone neutral. "Most folks around here see what they expect to see," Tessa replied, her voice taking on an edge he hadn't heard before. "They look at those dogs and see only teeth and hunger. They look at me and see only a spinster who wastes resources on strays instead of finding a husband." She paused, then added more softly, "I wonder what they see when they look at you, Blake Oberfield." The direct question caught him off guard, his hammer pausing mid-swing. "A drifter, I suppose, someone passing through, not worth getting to know." "And is that accurate?" Her green eyes held his, refusing to allow him the safety of evasion. Blake resumed hammering, focusing on the nail rather than her penetrating gaze. Accurate enough. I haven't stayed in one place longer than a season since I was 15. By choice or by circumstance, she pressed gently. The question was too perceptive, cutting closer to truths he'd buried long ago. Does it matter? The result's the same either way. Before Tessa could respond, a low whine from the edge of the yard caught their attention. The one-eared hound Blake had seen her feeding that first day stood watching them cautiously, flanked by two other dogs, a shaggy brown mutt and a smaller black dog with a white chest. "There they are," Tessa said softly, reaching into her pocket for scraps she apparently carried with her at all times. "I was wondering when they'd catch my scent." She moved slowly toward the animals, murmuring reassurances in a tone Blake recognized as similar to what he'd use with skittish horses. The two dogs that clearly knew her approached with cautious tails wagging, but the one-eared hound hung back, eyeing Blake with particular suspicion. "That's Thunder," Tessa explained, nodding toward the wary dog. "He's the newest and most distrustful. The brown one is Rusty and the little black one is Pepper. They've been with me the longest." Blake watched as she fed and stroked the two friendlier dogs, her face transformed by a gentleness that made his chest ache with an emotion he couldn't name. Without thinking, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a piece of jerky he'd been saving for the ride back to the ranch. "May I?" he asked, holding up the meat. Tessa's surprised smile was answer enough. She instructed him how to approach, how to offer the food with open palm and patient stillness. Blake followed her guidance, crouching down to appear less threatening, extending his hand with the jerky resting on his palm. Rusty approached first, accepting the offering with surprisingly delicate manners. Encouraged by his companion's success, Pepper ventured forward next, snatching the remaining piece with quick efficiency before retreating to a safe distance. Thunder remained aloof, watching the proceedings with intense focus but unwilling to approach the unfamiliar man. "He'll come around eventually," Tessa assured Blake, noting his disappointed expression. "It took weeks before he would take food directly from my hand." "What happened to his ear?" Blake asked, noticing the jagged tear more clearly now. Tessa's expression darkened. "Dog fights. Some of the men who work at the silver mines organize them for gambling. I suspect Thunder escaped or was discarded when he lost." Blake had seen such barbaric entertainment in various frontier towns, but had never participated. The deliberate cruelty seemed unnecessary in a land where natural dangers provided enough opportunities for death. "The shelter will be finished by tomorrow," he promised, looking at the half-completed structure. "It won't be pretty, but it'll be sturdy enough to keep them safe and dry." "Thank you," Tessa said, the simple words carrying a weight of genuine gratitude that made Blake uncomfortable with its intensity. No one had looked at him that way in a very long time, as though his actions mattered, as though he himself mattered beyond the labor he could provide. As they packed up the tools with the setting sun painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Blake realized with a jolt of alarm that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow not for the work it would bring, but for the company he would keep. True to his word, Blake returned the following afternoon to complete the shelter. Mr. Harrington, apparently approving of Tessa's project, had given her another half-day to assist. By sunset, a sturdy, if somewhat lopsided, structure stood in the back corner of the yard, complete with a latched gate that would allow the dogs to be contained safely when necessary. "It's perfect," Tessa declared, standing back to admire their handiwork. The simple praise warmed Blake more than it should have. "It'll keep them out of trouble with Mrs. Whitfield, at least," he replied with a shrug, trying to downplay his satisfaction with the finished project. As if summoned by the mention of trouble, the three dogs appeared at their usual time. This evening, however, they brought a fourth, a scrawny female with prominent ribs and wary eyes. "A new one," Tessa murmured, concern evident in her voice. She moved slowly toward her regular visitors, offering the usual scraps while keeping an eye on the newcomer, who maintained a careful distance. To Blake's surprise, Thunder approached him directly this time, sniffing cautiously at his boots before looking up with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess his character. Remembering yesterday's lesson, Blake slowly extended his hand, palm up, offering nothing but the chance for contact. The dog stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as he caught Blake's scent. After what seemed an eternity, Thunder stepped forward and briefly touched his nose to Blake's fingertips before retreating, not a full acceptance, but a significant concession from the suspicious animal. "Well," Tessa said softly from beside him, "you've made more progress in 2 days than most people would in a month." Blake glanced at her, struck by the warmth in her expression. "I've always had a way with the wary ones," he admitted. "My mother used to say it was because I understood what it meant to approach life with caution." The personal disclosure slipped out before he could catch it, one of the small, unguarded moments that seemed to occur with increasing frequency in Tessa's presence. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," she observed, her tone inviting further confidence without demanding it. Blake's throat tightened. "She was. Fever took her and my father when I was 15. That's when I started drifting." He hadn't intended to share that truth, had avoided mentioning his past to anyone in the years since it happened. Yet somehow, standing in the twilight with this woman who cared for creatures others had discarded, the words had emerged naturally. Tessa didn't offer empty condolences or prying questions. Instead, she simply placed her hand lightly on his arm, the touch conveying understanding that went beyond words. "Sometimes the hardest wounds to heal are the ones that can't be seen," she said quietly. They stood in companionable silence as darkness settled over the yard. The moment felt suspended in time, fragile and significant in ways Blake couldn't articulate even to himself. Finally, practicality reasserted itself. "I should get back to the ranch," he said reluctantly. "Early start tomorrow." Tessa nodded, withdrawing her hand. "Of course, thank you again for your help with the shelter. I couldn't have done it without you." As Blake prepared to leave, Thunder surprised them both by approaching once more, this time deliberately pressing against the cowboy's leg in a brief moment of contact before trotting away to join the other dogs. "Now that," Tessa said with quiet delight, "is something special. He's chosen you." The simple observation followed Blake all the way back to the ranch, echoing in his mind as he lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Thunder had chosen him. The question that kept him awake into the small hours was whether he was capable of choosing in return, of accepting the connection that had been offered instead of riding away as he always had before. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Blake found legitimate reasons to visit town twice a week, volunteering to deliver messages for Mr. Sanders or pick up supplies the ranch needed. Each visit inevitably included time at the general store, which expanded to include helping Tessa with the dogs behind the shop. The makeshift shelter now housed 5 animals regularly, with the newest addition, a female Tessa had named Lady, finally gaining enough weight to look healthy. Blake found himself bringing scraps from the ranch kitchen, saved from his own meals or charmed from the cook, who grumbled about feeding mutts instead of cowboys, but never actually refused his requests. On a warm July afternoon, Blake arrived at the store to find it unusually busy. A wagon train had stopped outside town, bringing families heading west to Oregon Territory. The store buzzed with activity as travelers stocked up on essentials, asked directions, and sought information about the trail ahead. Blake lingered near the back, watching as Tessa efficiently managed the crowd, answering questions about weather conditions and river crossings with knowledge that surprised him. When the rush finally subsided, he approached the counter. "You know a lot about the Oregon Trail for someone who's never made the journey," he observed. Tessa smiled as she straightened items displaced by eager customers. "My father was a circuit judge. He traveled extensively and kept detailed journals of every route, water source, and potential danger. I've read them all multiple times." A shadow crossed her face. "He always promised to take me to see the Pacific someday." The wistfulness in her voice revealed a longing Blake hadn't suspected, a desire to see beyond the confines of Riverspend that mirrored his own restlessness, though channeled differently. "Why haven't you gone?" he asked, genuinely curious. "After your father passed, I mean, nothing seems to be holding you here." The question was more personal than he'd intended, but Tessa didn't seem offended. She considered it thoughtfully as she continued tidying the counter. Partly practical concerns, traveling alone as a woman isn't safe, and joining a wagon train requires resources I don't have. She paused, her hands stilling on a bolt of calico. But also, leaving means abandoning things that matter to me. The dogs, for one, the people I've come to care about, the small difference I can make here. Her gaze met his, unexpectedly direct. "What about you, Blake? What keeps you moving rather than staying?" The question hit closer to home than he was comfortable with. He shifted, suddenly aware that their conversation had moved beyond casual exchange into territory he usually avoided. "Habit mostly," he answered with careful lightness. "Once you start drifting, it becomes what you know." Tessa studied him with those perceptive green eyes. Is that really all it is? Or is it safer to keep moving than to risk putting down roots that might be torn up again? The insight was too accurate to deflect with his usual evasions. Blake looked away, focusing on a display of canned peaches. "You're pretty direct for a shopkeeper. And you're pretty evasive for a man who builds shelters for stray dogs," she countered, a smile softening her words. Before Blake could formulate a response, the store door banged open, admitting a red-faced boy of about 12 who skidded to a halt in front of the counter. "Miss Grayson, come quick," he gasped, clearly having run some distance. "Your dogs are in trouble. Sheriff Collins and some men have gone to your yard with rifles." Tessa paled visibly. Without a word to Blake, she lifted her skirts and ran toward the back door, moving with a speed that belied her usual composed demeanor. Blake followed immediately, his longer stride allowing him to catch up as they rounded the corner of the building. The scene that greeted them made Blake's blood run cold. Sheriff Collins and 3 other men stood at the entrance to the yard, rifles raised. Inside the enclosure, Thunder stood protectively in front of the other dogs, his hackles raised and teeth bared in a threatening growl. "Sheriff Collins," Tessa called, her voice sharp with authority despite her breathlessness. "What is the meaning of this?" The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, turned with obvious discomfort. "Miss Grayson, I'm sorry, but there's been an incident. One of the wagon train children was bitten this morning by a stray dog. The description matches that one there." He nodded toward Thunder. "That's impossible," Tessa protested. "Thunder has been in this enclosure since yesterday afternoon. I locked the gate myself." "With respect, Miss Grayson, how can you be certain?" One of the other men, Blake recognized him as the blacksmith's apprentice, interjected. "These are wild animals. They come and go as they please." "Not anymore," Tessa countered firmly. "The shelter is secure and I've been working with these dogs daily. They're not wild and they're certainly not vicious." Sheriff Collins shifted uncomfortably. "Be that as it may, Miss Grayson, we have a frightened child, an angry family, and the town council breathing down my neck. The Whitfields have been complaining about these animals for months. I have orders to remove the threat." "By shooting dogs who haven't been proven guilty of anything," Blake stepped forward, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable edge. "That doesn't sound like justice, Sheriff. Sounds more like a convenient way to settle a grudge." Collins eyed Blake warily, taking in his rangy height and the deliberate way he positioned himself beside Tessa. "This isn't your concern, Oberfield. Sanders' hands don't have any say in town business." "Maybe not," Blake acknowledged, "but I know dogs, and I know a setup when I see one." He gestured toward Thunder, who continued to guard the other animals. "Look at him, he's protecting the weaker dogs. That's not the behavior of a vicious animal, it's the behavior of a loyal one." Tessa placed a steadying hand on Blake's arm, then addressed the sheriff directly. "At least give me the chance to examine the child's bite. If it doesn't match Thunder's jaw size or tooth pattern, you'll know he's innocent." The sheriff hesitated, clearly torn between following town council orders and respecting the daughter of a man who had once been his superior. Finally, he lowered his rifle slightly. "The wagon train is camped at the west edge of town. The family's name is Cooper. If and only if you can prove it wasn't your dog, I'll hold off. But Miss Grayson, this is your last chance." The counsel's patience is gone. Tessa nodded, her posture rigid with controlled emotion. "Thank you, Sheriff, I'll go immediately." She turned to Blake, her voice dropping. "Will you stay with them? I don't trust that they won't return the moment I leave." Blake understood the significance of what she was asking, to publicly align himself with her cause, potentially antagonizing both the town leadership and his employer. The prudent choice, the one consistent with his pattern of avoiding entanglements, would be to politely decline. Instead, he found himself nodding. "Go, I'll make sure they're safe until you return." The gratitude in her eyes made his chest constrict with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. She hurried away toward the wagon train encampment, leaving Blake facing 3 armed men with nothing but determination, and the knowledge that he was protecting something that mattered deeply to Tessa. "You're making a mistake, Oberfield," the blacksmith's apprentice muttered as the sheriff and the 3rd man reluctantly departed, "getting mixed up with the Grayson woman and her strays. Nothing but trouble will come of it." Blake didn't bother responding. He simply crossed his arms and planted himself firmly at the gate of the enclosure, prepared to wait as long as necessary for Tessa's return. Inside the yard, Thunder gradually relaxed his defensive posture, though his alert gaze remained fixed on Blake, not with the suspicion of their early encounters, but with what appeared to be wary appreciation for the human standing guard between his pack and danger. An hour later, Tessa returned, accompanied by a weary-looking woman and a young girl with a bandaged arm. The sheriff trailed behind them, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "Mrs. Cooper has agreed to show us her daughter's injury," Tessa explained, her voice carefully neutral despite the triumph Blake could see in her eyes. The woman unwrapped the bandage, revealing puncture marks that were clearly too small and closely spaced to have been made by a dog of Thunder's size. "Emily says it was a small dog, brown with a white spot on its chest," Mrs. Cooper explained. "She tried to pet it and it got scared and snapped at her. My husband overreacted when he reported it. He's always been fearful of rabies." Sheriff Collins cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, it seems Miss Grayson was right. None of her dogs match that description." "No," Tessa agreed firmly, "they don't. And I'd appreciate it if the town council were informed of that fact, along with my continued commitment to keeping these animals safely contained." The sheriff nodded, tipping his hat in a gesture that managed to convey both apology and retreat. "I'll see to it personally, Miss Grayson." As the group dispersed, Tessa turned to Blake, emotion finally breaking through her composed facade. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice catching slightly, "for staying. For standing up for them when it would have been easier not to." Blake found himself unable to maintain his usual distance in the face of her genuine gratitude. "They're worth protecting," he said quietly. "Like you said, they just need someone to see beyond what others expect to see." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared values that went deeper than casual acquaintance or practical alliance. As they entered the yard together to check on the dogs, Blake was acutely aware that the careful boundaries he'd maintained, since his parents' death, were beginning to crumble in the presence of this woman who fought so passionately for creatures others deemed worthless. Thunder approached them both this time, pressing first against Tessa's skirts before moving to Blake, actually leaning against his leg in a gesture of clear trust. The simple act of acceptance from an animal that had known only cruelty and abandonment struck Blake with unexpected force. "He knows," Tessa said softly, watching the interaction. "Animals always know who they can trust." Blake reached down to touch Thunder's scarred head, feeling the solid warmth of the dog beneath his palm. "I'm not sure I deserve that trust," he admitted, voicing a doubt that applied to more than just his relationship with the animal. Tessa's gaze held his, unwavering and clear. "Trust isn't about deserving, Blake. It's about recognizing something true in another soul, even when they don't see it themselves." The words lingered between them, laden with meaning that extended far beyond the quiet moment in the yard. As Blake reluctantly departed for the ranch, He carried with him the unsettling awareness that for the first time in over a decade, he was developing connections he couldn't easily sever, not just with Tessa, but with the creatures she had taught him to see through different eyes. July gave way to August, bringing scorching days that tested man and beast alike. The work at Circle S intensified as preparations began for the fall cattle drive. Blake found himself exhausted each evening, yet still made time twice weekly to visit town, visits that increasingly centered around Tessa and the growing pack of rehabilitated dogs behind the general store. The shelter now housed 7 dogs permanently, with 3 others that came regularly for food but preferred to maintain their independence. What had begun as a simple protective structure had evolved into a proper kennel, with additional materials donated by townsfolk who had gradually shifted from skepticism to cautious support. This change in attitude was due largely to Tessa's persistent efforts to demonstrate the dog's value. She had successfully trained Rusty to herd Mr. Peterson's chickens, and Pepper had revealed an unexpected talent for ratting that made him welcome at the grain storage building. Even Thunder, once considered the most dangerous, now accompanied Tessa on her errands through town, his protective presence at her side a deterrent to any who might hassle a woman walking alone. Blake's involvement had also grown from occasional assistance to active partnership. He'd spent several Sundays teaching Tessa techniques for training working dogs, drawing on knowledge gained through years on various ranches. Together they had established a routine that was gradually transforming former strays into animals with purpose, and in the process, creating a bond between themselves that neither acknowledged directly but both felt with increasing intensity. On a particularly hot afternoon, Blake arrived at the store to find Mr. Harrington alone behind the counter. "If you're looking for Miss Grayson," the older man said with a knowing smile that made Blake uncomfortable, "she's at the creek with those dogs of hers." Said something about teaching the new one to swim. Blake nodded his thanks, trying to ignore the shopkeeper's amused expression, as he headed toward the small creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. He found Tessa exactly where Harrington had indicated, standing ankle-deep in the shallow water, her skirts kilted up to reveal sturdy boots and a practical approach to the day's heat. 5 dogs splashed around her, Thunder standing regally in the deeper water while the others frolicked with varying degrees of enthusiasm. A 6th dog, a medium-sized animal with a distinctive brindle coat, watched nervously from the bank, clearly the new one Harrington had mentioned. The scene struck Blake with unexpected force. Tessa's hair had come partially loose from its usual neat arrangement, honey-blonde strands curling damply around her flushed face. Her laughter as she encouraged the hesitant dog carried across the water, unguarded and joyful in a way that made his heart constrict with a longing he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. She spotted him and waved, her smile widening in greeting. "Blake, come help me convince Patches that water won't dissolve him." Without giving himself time to reconsider, Blake removed his boots and rolled up his trouser legs before wading into the creek. The cool water was a blessed relief from the August heat, but it was Tessa's delighted expression at his immediate compliance that warmed him from within. "Patches came to us 3 days ago," she explained, gesturing toward the nervous dog on the shore. "Mr. Sanders actually sent him down with one of your fellow hands, said he kept trying to follow the cattle but was too skittish to be properly trained at the ranch." Blake raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Sanders sent him to you deliberately, not just to get rid of him." Tessa nodded, clearly pleased, "with a message suggesting you might be able to help assess whether he has potential as a herding dog once he's less fearful. Apparently, your employer has been paying attention to our little project here." The revelation that Joseph Sanders not only knew about, but apparently approved of Blake's involvement with the dogs was unexpected. He'd been careful not to neglect his duties at the ranch, but had assumed his regular trips to town had been noted with the typical cowhand's ribald speculation about a woman's involvement. "Sanders is a practical man," Blake observed, moving carefully through the water toward the nervous dog on the shore. "If he thinks there's value in what you're doing, it's a significant endorsement." Together they coaxed Patches into the shallow water, using gentle encouragement and the example of the other dog's evident enjoyment. By the time the sun began to lower toward the western horizon, the brindle dog was splashing cautiously alongside Thunder, who displayed unexpected patience with the newcomer. As they herded the tired, wet animals back toward town, Blake found himself walking close beside Tessa, their arms occasionally brushing in a way that sent awareness shimmering through him despite the innocent nature of the contact. "Will you be at the harvest dance next weekend?" Tessa asked suddenly, her eyes focused on the dogs trotting ahead of them rather than on Blake's face. The question caught him off guard. The annual harvest dance was Riverspend's major social event, marking the end of summer and the beginning of the harvest season. It was exactly the sort of community gathering Blake had studiously avoided in every town he'd passed through, a celebration predicated on the assumption of permanence, of belonging. "I hadn't planned on it," he answered truthfully. "Not really one for social gatherings." Tessa nodded, still not meeting his gaze. "Of course, I just thought," she stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. "The dogs will miss your regular visit if you're working." Blake knew an evasion when he heard one, having deployed enough of them himself. Something tightened in his chest at the realization that she had been hoping he would attend, perhaps even hoping he would accompany her. "I suppose I could make time," he found himself saying, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the decision. "Sanders usually gives most hands the evening off for the dance." The smile that illuminated her face made the immediate regret at his impulsive acceptance fade into insignificance. "Wonderful. The entire town attends. There's music and dancing in the town square, and Mrs. Ruttledge's apple cider is worth the trip all by itself." Her enthusiasm was infectious, making Blake momentarily forget all the reasons why deepening his connection to Riverspend, and to Tessa in particular, was contrary to the rules he'd lived by for over a decade. As they parted at the entrance to the yard behind the store, Tessa reached out impulsively and squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you'll be there, Blake." The simple touch and genuine warmth in her voice stayed with him long after he'd returned to the ranch, distracting him from his evening chores and following him into restless dreams where green eyes and honey-blonde hair featured prominently. The harvest dance arrived with perfect late summer weather, warm days giving way to cool evenings that hinted at the approaching fall. Blake spent more time than he'd ever admit preparing for the event, bathing in the creek behind the ranch house and shaving with particular care before donning his one good shirt, freshly washed and pressed by the ranch cook's wife in exchange for a promise to dance with her daughter. His fellow hands noticed the unusual attention to his appearance, of course. The good-natured ribbing followed him out of the bunkhouse as he departed for town earlier than strictly necessary. His stomach knotted with an anticipation he hadn't felt since he was a green boy courting the blacksmith's daughter in a town whose name he could barely remember now. The town square had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, casting a warm glow over trestle tables laden with food contributed by every household. A small group of musicians had set up on the porch of the hotel, their fiddles and banjos already drawing couples onto the packed earth that served as a dance floor. Blake stood at the edge of the gathering, fighting the familiar urge to retreat from the press of humanity. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Tessa among the swirling skirts and pressed shirts of townsfolk he recognized, but had never truly engaged with. "Didn't expect to see you here, Oberfield." Joseph Sanders appeared at his side, offering a glass of amber liquid that Blake accepted with murmured thanks. "Miss Grayson's influence, I take it." Blake took a sip, buying time before responding. The whiskey burned pleasantly going down. "Just thought I'd see what the fuss was about," he replied noncommittally. Sanders chuckled, clearly unconvinced. "She's a remarkable woman. Judge Grayson raised her with more education than most men around these parts have, but she's practical too. Got her father's sense of justice and her mother's kindness." He gave Blake a sidelong glance. "Not the sort of woman who'd be content with a man who drifts with the seasons." The observation, delivered casually but with clear intent, hit its mark with uncomfortable precision. Before Blake could formulate a response, Sanders clapped him on the shoulder and moved away, leaving him with the unwelcome awareness that his employer had seen through his careful detachment to the growing attachment beneath. Blake. He turned at the sound of his name, and the sight of Tessa approaching through the crowd drove all other thoughts from his mind. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, pale blue with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck, with a few soft curls framing her face. But it was her smile, bright with genuine pleasure at seeing him, that affected Blake most deeply. "You came," she said simply, reaching his side slightly breathless from navigating the crowded square. "I said I would," he replied, suddenly acutely aware of how plain his own attire was compared to the careful elegance of hers. Tessa seemed not to notice or care about any disparity. "Mrs. Rutledge has been asking after you. She claims you're the only one who properly appreciated her apple dumplings at the church social last month." Blake blinked in confusion. "I've never been to a church social." Tessa's eyes danced with mischief. "I know that, but I may have shared some of those dumplings with certain four-legged friends, and Mrs. Rutledge caught me. I blamed you rather than admit I was feeding pastries to dogs." The unexpected admission startled a laugh from Blake, a genuine, unguarded sound that felt foreign to his own ears. "So I'm your accomplice now. Corrupting perfectly good dumplings by giving them to strays." "Precisely," she agreed with mock seriousness. "I'm afraid you're thoroughly implicated in my scandalous behavior. Your reputation for respectability is entirely compromised." Their easy banter continued as Tessa led him through the gathering, introducing him to townspeople he'd seen but never properly met. To his surprise, Blake found himself welcomed not as Sanders' temporary hand, but as Miss Grayson's friend who's helping with those clever dogs. The distinction was subtle but significant, identifying him through his connection to Tessa rather than his transient employment. As the evening progressed and the music continued, Blake found himself drawn into the community celebration despite his usual reservations. He kept his promise to dance with the cook's daughter, a shy girl of 17 who blushed furiously throughout the reel but seemed pleased by his careful attention to the steps. When he finally gathered the courage to ask Tessa to dance, the musicians had shifted to a slower waltz. She placed her hand in his without hesitation, allowing him to lead her onto the floor with a grace that made him suddenly grateful for his mother's insistence on teaching him proper dancing years ago. "I didn't expect you to be so accomplished," Tessa observed as they moved together through the familiar three-step pattern. Blake managed a self-deprecating smile. "My mother believed every boy should know how to dance properly, no matter where life took him. She'd drag out the old fiddle on winter evenings and make my father practice with her while I watched. Eventually, I had to take my turn too." The memory, offered without the usual painful constriction in his chest, surprised Blake almost as much as the words themselves. Something about the warmth of Tessa's hand in his, the trust implicit in her following his lead, made sharing this small piece of his past feel natural rather than threatening. "She sounds wonderful," Tessa said softly. "I wish I could have known her." The simple statement, delivered without pity or awkward condolence, opened a door Blake had kept firmly shut for years. "She would have liked you," he said, the truth of it resonating through him. "She always said kindness was the most undervalued virtue in the West." As they continued to dance, Blake became increasingly aware of how perfectly Tessa fit against him. Her hand small but strong in his, her waist beneath his palm a warm curve that seemed designed for his touch. The scent of lavender rose from her hair, mingling with the summer night air in a combination that made him lightheaded in a way that had nothing to do with the single glass of whiskey he'd consumed. When the music ended, neither of them moved immediately to separate. For a suspended moment, they stood together at the edge of the dance floor, connected by more than just the physical proximity of their bodies. "Would you like to walk?" Tessa asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor that mirrored the unsettled rhythm of Blake's own heartbeat. "It's rather warm with so many people." He nodded, unable to trust his voice for a response. Together they slipped away from the crowded square, moving by unspoken agreement toward the quieter streets that led to the creek where they had taught Patches to swim. The evening air had cooled enough to make their earlier excuse plausible, though Blake suspected neither of them had been genuinely overheated by anything other than the awareness that had been building between them for weeks. They walked in companionable silence, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed, each contact sending a current of anticipation through Blake's body. When they reached the creek bank, Tessa paused, turning to face him in the silver moonlight that filtered through the cottonwood branches overhead. Away from the lanterns of the town square, her features were softened into a luminous beauty that made Blake's breath catch. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know social gatherings aren't easy for you." Blake shook his head slightly. "It wasn't so difficult, not with you there." The admission cost him something in vulnerability, but the smile that illuminated her face in response made the risk worthwhile. "Blake," she began, then hesitated, seeming to gather her courage. "I need to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer, even if it's not what I want to hear." The serious note in her voice sent a tendril of apprehension through him. "All right." Tessa met his gaze directly, her green eyes reflecting both determination and a vulnerability that matched his own. "Are you planning to leave when the cattle drive is finished next month?" The question struck at the heart of the conflict that had been building within Blake since he first saw her kneeling in the dirt behind the church. His initial instinct was to deflect, to offer the noncommittal response that had served him well for years. But something in her direct gaze demanded honesty, even if that honesty revealed uncertainties he'd been avoiding confronting. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I always have before." Tessa nodded, accepting his answer without judgment. "And now, has anything changed for you, Blake?" Everything had changed, though he'd been fighting against that recognition with increasingly futile determination. The carefully maintained distance he'd preserved for a decade had been steadily eroded by Tessa's gentle persistence, by the trust of creatures he'd helped save, by the unexpected sense of belonging he'd experienced during the evening's celebration. "Yes," he said simply, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised him even as he spoke it. "Everything has changed." He reached for her then, his hand cradling the soft curve of her cheek as he lowered his head to hers. Their lips met in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more honest than any interaction Blake had allowed himself in years. Tessa's arms slid around his neck, her body pressing against his with a trust and desire that broke through the final barriers of his resistance. When they finally separated, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I've spent 11 years believing that not getting attached was the only way to survive out here," he confessed. "That caring for anything or anyone just meant more pain when it was inevitably lost." Tessa's fingers traced the line of his jaw with tender exploration. "And now I'm terrified," he admitted with raw honesty, "because I care more than I thought possible, and the thought of losing you or leaving you feels worse than any pain I was trying to avoid." Her smile in the moonlight held both understanding and promise. "Fear isn't always a warning to retreat, Blake. Sometimes it's just the natural response to recognizing how much something matters." As they walked back toward town, hand in hand beneath the star-filled sky, Blake felt a strange lightness replacing the weight he'd carried for so long. Nothing had been resolved, he still had obligations to the cattle drive, and the prospect of permanence remained daunting. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider a future defined by connection rather than deliberate isolation. September brought the preparations for the Circle S cattle drive into full swing. Blake found himself working from dawn until dusk, with barely enough energy each night to fall into his bunk before rising to do it all again. His visits to town became necessarily less frequent, though he made time at least once a week to see Tessa and check on the progress with the dogs. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them defined explicitly but both recognized as significant. The kiss by the creek had been followed by others, stolen moments of connection that sustained Blake through the grueling days of preparation. They spoke little of the future, both aware of the uncertainty hanging over them as the date for the cattle drive approached. Then came the day that changed everything. Blake had ridden into town on a rare afternoon off, hoping to spend a few hours with Tessa and perhaps take her for a proper drive in the buggy he'd arranged to borrow from one of the other hands. He found the general store unusually quiet, with Mr. Harrington looking troubled behind the counter. "She's out back," the shopkeeper said before Blake could ask. "Been there all morning with that newest dog. Arrived in bad shape, looks like it tangled with a mountain lion or wolf." Blake thanked him and made his way quickly through the store to the yard beyond. He found Tessa kneeling beside a crude pallet, her hands working carefully over the still form of a large dog whose tawny coat was matted with dried blood. She looked up at his approach, her face drawn with concern. "Blake, thank goodness, I could use your help." He knelt beside her, taking in the extent of the animal's injuries. Deep lacerations scored its flank and shoulder, and one ear was nearly torn away. Despite the obvious pain, the dog's amber eyes were alert, watching Blake with the wary intelligence he'd come to recognize in animals that had known both human cruelty and wilderness dangers. "Mountain lion?" he asked, keeping his voice low and calm. Tessa nodded grimly. "That's my guess. Mr. Peterson found him collapsed by his north fence line this morning and brought him to me in his wagon. I've cleaned the wounds as best I can, but he needs stitching, and I've never done that on anything larger than a torn shirt." Without hesitation, Blake set to work, drawing on years of practical frontier medicine learned through necessity. He sent Tessa for needle and thread, whiskey for disinfection, and clean rags. Together they worked over the injured animal for more than an hour, Blake's steady hands closing the worst of the wounds while Tessa soothed and restrained the patient with gentle firmness. The dog, whom Tessa had already named Ranger, endured their ministrations with stoic dignity, only occasionally whimpering when the pain became too intense. By the time they finished, the afternoon was waning, and both Blake and Tessa were exhausted and blood-stained. "He should rest now," Blake said, washing his hands in the bucket of water Tessa had provided. "The wounds are clean, and the stitches should hold if he doesn't tear at them. You'll need to change the bandages twice daily for at least a week." Tessa nodded, her face reflecting both fatigue and deep concern. "I'll move my bedroll out here tonight to keep watch. If infection sets in, we could lose him despite our best efforts." The "we" didn't escape Blake's notice. The automatic inclusion of him in her concerns, the assumption of shared responsibility. It should have triggered his usual wariness about entanglement. Instead, he found himself nodding in agreement. "I'll come back after evening chores," he said. "We can take turns watching through the night." Tessa looked up at him with surprise that quickly softened into gratitude. "You don't have to do that, you have work tomorrow." Blake shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "So I'll be tired, wouldn't be the first time." He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch lingering longer than necessary. "Besides, he's fighting hard to live. Seems only fair we fight alongside him." Something in Tessa's expression shifted at his words, a deepening of emotion that made Blake's heart race with both anticipation and fear. "You're not who everyone thinks you are, Blake Oberfield," she said softly. "Not even who you think you are yourself." Before he could respond to this unsettling observation, Thunder approached, nudging against Blake's leg in what had become a familiar greeting. The dog then moved to inspect the newcomer, sniffing carefully at Ranger's still form before settling beside the pallet in a clearly protective position. "Looks like Ranger has a guardian," Blake observed, grateful for the diversion from Tessa's too perceptive comment. She nodded, a small smile replacing her serious expression. "They recognize kindred spirits. Those who have survived against the odds tend to look out for one another." Blake couldn't help feeling that her words applied to more than just the dogs. True to his word, he returned that evening after completing his duties at the ranch. He brought his bedroll, extra bandages he'd charmed from the ranch cook, and a container of broth that might tempt the injured dog to eat. Tessa welcomed him with evident relief, her face showing the strain of constant vigilance. They established a watch rotation, with Tessa taking the first shift while Blake tried to rest. Despite his physical exhaustion, sleep proved elusive as he lay in the yard under the star-filled sky, acutely aware of Tessa sitting just a few feet away, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern as she monitored their patient. In the quiet darkness, with only the occasional whimper from Ranger or restless movement of the other dogs to break the silence, Blake found himself contemplating a future he'd been carefully avoiding examining directly. The cattle drive would depart in 2 weeks. Sanders had already asked which hands planned to return to the ranch afterward versus continuing on to other opportunities. Blake had left the question unanswered, claiming he needed time to consider his options. The truth was more complicated. For the first time since his parents' death, the thought of moving on filled him with reluctance rather than anticipation. Riversbend had somehow become more than just another stop on an endless journey. It had developed the dangerous allure of potential permanence. And Tessa, she had become essential in ways that terrified him precisely because he could no longer imagine a future without her presence in it. "You should be sleeping," her soft voice broke into his thoughts. "Your watch is in 3 hours." Blake rolled onto his side, facing her. "Mine's too busy," he admitted. "Thinking about the drive." Tessa nodded, her expression carefully neutral in the lantern light. 2 weeks now, isn't it? Sanders asked today who's planning to return afterward. The simple statement hung between them, laden with unspoken questions. Tessa focused on adjusting Ranger's bandage, her hands gentle but precise. "And what did you tell him?" she finally asked, her voice deliberately casual. Blake hesitated, knowing his answer mattered more than any he'd given in years. "That I needed time to consider my options." Tessa's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their task. "I see." 2 simple words that conveyed volumes of understanding and carefully restrained emotion. Blake sat up, unable to maintain the pretense of attempted sleep any longer. "Tessa," he began, then faltered, unsure how to articulate the conflict within him. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than a season since I was 15. I'm not sure I remember how." She met his gaze steadily across the small space separating them. "Perhaps it's not so different from what you did today with Ranger. You see something worth saving, worth fighting for, and you simply choose not to walk away when it becomes difficult." The parallel struck Blake with unexpected force. His immediate instinct with the injured dog had been to help, to commit to its survival regardless of the inconvenience or uncertainty of outcome. The choice had seemed natural, even necessary, despite knowing the animal might not survive their best efforts. "And if it doesn't work," he asked quietly, "if I stay and it all falls apart anyway?" Tessa's expression softened with understanding. "That's the risk with anything that matters, isn't it?" "But Blake," she leaned forward slightly, her eyes intent on his. "You've been leaving before anything has the chance to fail or succeed for 11 years. Don't you want to know just once what might happen if you stayed?" The question penetrated defenses Blake had maintained for so long they had become part of his identity. Before he could formulate a response, Ranger stirred restlessly, drawing Tessa's immediate attention back to their patient. "His fever's rising," she said with concern, placing a hand on the dog's flank. "We need to cool him down." The moment of vulnerability passed as they focused on the practical necessity of caring for the injured animal. Blake fetched fresh water from the pump, and together they bathed Ranger's overheated body with cool cloths, speaking to him in soft, encouraging tones throughout the procedure. By morning, the crisis had passed. Ranger's fever broke just before dawn, and he accepted a small amount of the broth Blake had brought, a promising sign of recovery. As the early light filtered into the yard, revealing their exhausted faces and blood-stained clothing, Tessa smiled at Blake with a weary triumph that made his chest ache with emotion he couldn't fully name. "We did it," she said simply. "He's going to live." Blake nodded, reaching out to stroke the dog's head gently. "He's a fighter, just needed someone to believe he was worth the effort." Tessa's hand found his over Ranger's still form, their fingers intertwining in a connection that felt both natural and profound. "That's true of most living things, don't you think? Dogs, people. We all do better when someone believes we're worth fighting for." In that moment, with dawn breaking over the small yard filled with animals they had saved together, Blake finally confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He loved Tessa Grayson. Not just her kindness or her determination or her beauty, though all those things had drawn him to her initially. He loved the way she saw value where others saw only liabilities, the way she fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves, the way she had looked past his carefully maintained isolation to the man beneath. And with that recognition came the terrifying awareness that the choice before him was no longer about whether to stay in Riverspend or move on to the next job. It was about whether he had the courage to embrace the possibility of a life defined by connection rather than deliberate detachment, a life with Tessa at its center. The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool, with the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. Blake had been up before first light, checking his gear and the provisions for the 3-week journey to the railhead in Cheyenne. Around him, the other hands engaged in similar preparations, the bunkhouse filled with the subdued excitement that always preceded a drive. Blake's own emotions were considerably more complex. In the 2 weeks since the night they had saved Ranger, he and Tessa had spent every possible moment together. They had walked by the creek, shared quiet dinners at the small table behind the store, and continued their work with the dogs, now numbering 9 permanent residents with several others that came regularly for food and attention. Through it all, the question of Blake's return after the drive hung between them, acknowledged but never directly addressed. Tessa had not pressed him for a decision, though he caught the question in her eyes each time they parted. Blake himself had vacillated daily, sometimes hourly, between the security of his familiar pattern and the increasingly undeniable pull of what Riverspend and Tessa offered. As he secured his bedroll behind his saddle, Joseph Sanders approached, his weathered face inscrutable in the pre-dawn light. "Oberfield," the rancher nodded in greeting. "Got a moment?" Blake followed his employer a short distance from the bustle of preparation, wondering what last-minute instructions or changes to the plan might require a private conversation. "You never did answer my question about returning after the drive," Sanders said without preamble, fixing Blake with a direct gaze. Blake shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his hat. "Still considering my options, Mr. Sanders." The older man snorted softly. "Bull, you're torn between what you want and what you're afraid of, and there's no option about it." He held up a hand as Blake started to protest. "I don't need an answer for the ranch's sake. We've got enough hands staying on. I'm asking for your sake." The unexpected personal interest caught Blake off guard. "Sir." Sanders sighed, looking briefly toward the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to lighten the sky. "I knew your father, Oberfield. Not well, but we crossed paths a few times when I was running cattle in Dakota Territory." Blake stared at his employer in shock. In all the months he'd worked at the Circle S, Sanders had never mentioned this connection. "William Oberfield was a good man," Sanders continued. "Steady, reliable, had a way with horses that you clearly inherited. When Miller recommended you, I recognized the name but wasn't sure until I saw you work." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Your father would be proud of the horseman you've become, but I expect he'd be concerned about the man who can't seem to stay anywhere long enough to build something lasting." The observation, delivered without judgment but with undeniable perception, struck Blake with uncomfortable precision. "My parents died when I was 15, he said stiffly. "Things change." Sanders nodded, unsurprised by the information. "Life has a way of dealing hard blows, especially out here. The question isn't whether you get knocked down, it's whether you get back up and keep building anyway." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper, which he handed to Blake. "I had the lawyer draw this up last week. It's an offer for a permanent position here, not just as a hand, but as foreman for the horse operation. Current foreman's heading back east to take care of his ailing father." Blake unfolded the paper with numb fingers, scanning the terms of an offer that was more generous than any he'd received in his years of drifting. "Why would you offer this to me? You know my history, never stayed anywhere long." "Because you're the best horseman I've seen in a decade," Sanders replied simply. And because in the months you've been here, I've watched you start building something worth staying for, not just with Miss Grayson, though that's part of it, but with yourself. The way you've helped with those dogs of hers, the respect you've earned from the other hands, the care you take with every animal in your charge." He shrugged. "A man who builds like that deserves the chance to see what grows from his efforts." Blake stared at the contract in his hands, emotions warring within him. Gratitude, fear, hope, uncertainty. "I need to think about this." Sanders nodded, apparently having expected this response. "Contract will be waiting when you get back from the drive, along with everything else worth returning for." He glanced meaningfully toward town before turning back to the preparations, leaving Blake alone with a decision that suddenly felt much more concrete than the abstract possibility he'd been avoiding. The drive departed an hour later, 300 head of cattle beginning the slow journey south under the guidance of 15 men on horseback. Blake had ridden into town briefly before leaving, only to find the general store already busy with customers and Tessa occupied with a family buying provisions for their own journey west. Their goodbye had been hurried and public, a brief moment where their hands touched over the counter as she handed him the extra bandanas he'd purchased, their eyes conveying more than words could in the crowded store. Blake had wanted to tell her about Sanders' offer, about the tumult of emotions it had triggered, but there hadn't been time or privacy for such a conversation. As he rode now alongside the herd, dust rising around him in the morning light, Blake found himself picturing Tessa's face with painful clarity. The warmth of her smile, the intelligence in her green eyes, the quiet strength that had gradually dismantled the walls he'd built around himself. For the first time in 11 years, the prospect of returning to a place pulled at him more strongly than the urge to move on. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Like the injured dog they had fought to save together, Blake found himself at a crossroads between surrendering to old wounds or fighting for a future that offered no guarantees except the certainty that it mattered. The cattle drive proved more challenging than anticipated. Unseasonably heavy rains had swollen river crossings, and an early cold snap sent temperatures plummeting unexpectedly in the high country they needed to traverse. By the third week they were behind schedule, the men and animals both showing signs of the difficult conditions. Blake had been placed in charge of the remuda, the herd of spare horses that accompanied the drive, a position of significant responsibility that kept him constantly vigilant. At night, exhausted from long days in the saddle, he found his thoughts invariably turning to Riverspend, to Tessa, and to the decision that awaited him once the cattle were safely delivered. Sanders' offer of a permanent position had taken root in his mind, growing from an abstract possibility into something increasingly concrete. Blake found himself mentally rearranging the small cabin near the horse pasture that came with the foreman position, imagining adjustments that would make it more comfortable, more like a home than merely shelter. And in these imaginings, Tessa was always present. Her books on shelves he would build, her garden outside the kitchen window, her voice filling spaces that had been silent for too long. The night before they reached the railhead, Blake sat by the fire long after the other men had retired to their bedrolls. The cattle were settled, the horses secure, and the sky overhead blazed with stars in the clear mountain air. Into this rare moment of solitude rode Joseph Sanders, returning from scouting the trail ahead for the final day's journey. The rancher dismounted with the stiffness of a man who had spent decades in the saddle, joining Blake by the fire without invitation or explanation. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, each lost in his own thoughts as the flames cast flickering shadows across their tired faces. "Made your decision yet?" Sanders finally asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Blake stared into the embers, seeing patterns that reminded him of the dappled light on Tessa's hair when they walked by the creek. "Thinking I might take that foreman position," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease. "If the offer still stands." Sanders nodded as though the answer was exactly what he'd expected. "Glad to hear it. That cabin needs a good woman's touch, though, been empty too long." The subtle prompt made Blake smile despite his exhaustion. "I reckon it has." Another comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional snort from the nearby horses or distant lowing of the cattle. "When my Martha died," Sanders said unexpectedly, "I nearly sold the ranch and headed for California. Couldn't see the point in building something that no longer had her in it." He tossed his stick into the fire, watching as it caught and flared. "Stayed because running seemed harder than facing the emptiness. 20 years later, I'm glad I did. Built something that matters, not just the ranch but connections to people, to the land itself." Blake recognized the confidence for what it was, not merely advice, but a sharing of hard-won wisdom from a man who understood loss. "Were you ever sorry for staying instead of starting fresh somewhere else?" Sanders considered the question thoughtfully. There were days, still are sometimes, when the memories hurt sharp as a new wound, but regret. No, he looked directly at Blake, his gaze steady in the firelight. "Running from pain just means you carry it with you to new places. Facing it where it found you, that's how you eventually move beyond it." The simple truth resonated through Blake with unexpected force. For 11 years, he'd been carrying his grief and fear from town to town, ranch to ranch, believing that movement would somehow lessen their weight. Instead, the constant drifting had only ensured that nothing new could take root strongly enough to counterbalance the old pain. "I'm going to ask her to marry me," Blake said quietly, the decision crystallizing as he spoke the words aloud for the first time. "When we get back." Sanders smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "About time." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small velvet pouch which he handed to Blake. "Thought you might be needing this." Blake opened the pouch with curious fingers, tipping its contents into his palm. A simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center gleamed in the firelight. "Was Martha's," Sanders explained gruffly. "Our daughter wears her mother's wedding band, but this was an anniversary gift. Martha would want it used for a proper proposal, rather than sitting in my drawer gathering dust." Overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture, Blake struggled to find words adequate to his emotions. "Mr. Sanders, I can't." "You can," the older man interrupted firmly. "Consider it an advance on your wages as foreman if your pride needs the excuse, but take it. Miss Grayson deserves something pretty to look at while she's putting up with your stubborn hide for the next 50 years. Blake closed his fingers carefully around the ring, the small weight in his palm representing a future he'd spent years convincing himself he neither wanted nor deserved. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing the words were insufficient but unable to articulate the deeper gratitude he felt. Sanders nodded once, then rose with a slight groan as his joints protested. "Get some sleep, Oberfield. Tomorrow we deliver these beeves, and then you've got more important business waiting back in Riverspend." As the rancher walked away toward his own bedroll, Blake remained by the dying fire, the ring warm in his hand and his mind filled with plans and possibilities that had been unthinkable just months before. The return journey to Riverspend took less time than the outbound drive, with the men and horses moving more freely without cattle to herd. Even so, Blake found himself growing increasingly impatient as familiar landmarks appeared, signaling their approach to the town that had unexpectedly become the focus of his hopes rather than just another temporary stop. They arrived late on a crisp October afternoon, the setting sun gilding the modest buildings of Riverspend with golden light that made the town appear almost magical to Blake's travel-weary eyes. Sanders had ridden ahead to alert the ranch that the drive had been successful, leaving the men to return at their own pace. Blake separated from the others as they reached the outskirts of town, turning his tired horse toward the general store rather than continuing to the ranch. He'd taken special care that morning to shave and change into his cleanest shirt, though nothing could entirely erase the trail dust and exhaustion of 3 weeks on the drive. The store was quiet when he entered, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to match the nervous excitement in his chest. Mr. Harrington looked up from behind the counter, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "Thought you might be showing up today," the shopkeeper remarked. "She's out back with those dogs of yours, been keeping busy while you were gone, got 3 of them placed with good families already." Blake nodded his thanks, making his way through the store with long strides that betrayed his eagerness despite his attempt at casual demeanor. As he stepped into the yard behind the building, the familiar scene that greeted him made his heart constrict with emotion he no longer tried to suppress. Tessa knelt in the dirt, much as she had that first day he'd seen her behind the church, surrounded by dogs of various sizes and descriptions. She was brushing Ranger's coat, the animal having recovered remarkably from his near-fatal injuries. Thunder sat beside her with the dignity of a self-appointed guardian, while the other dogs engaged in various activities around the expanded shelter Blake had helped build. For a moment Blake simply watched, savoring the tableau that represented everything he'd spent years convincing himself he could live without: connection, purpose, belonging, love. Then Thunder spotted him and gave a sharp bark of recognition, drawing Tessa's attention to the yard entrance. She turned, the brush freezing in her hand as she registered his presence. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other across the space that separated them, a space that suddenly seemed to represent all the distance Blake had maintained throughout his adult life, all the barriers he'd erected between himself and genuine attachment. Then Tessa was on her feet, moving toward him with a smile that outshone the setting sun. Blake closed the remaining distance in long strides, meeting her halfway and catching her in an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. She laughed against his neck, her arms winding around his shoulders as he held her close, breathing in the familiar lavender scent of her hair. "You came back," she said when he finally set her down, her hands remaining on his arms as though reassuring herself of his solidity. "I came home," Blake corrected quietly, the word feeling both foreign and absolutely right on his tongue. Tessa's eyes widened slightly at his choice of words, hope and caution warring in her expression. "Does that mean—" "Sanders offered me the foreman position for the horse operation before we left," Blake explained, keeping his arms around her waist, unwilling to relinquish the contact now that he had it again. "I've accepted." The joy that transformed her features was worth every mile of dusty trail, every doubt he'd wrestled with, every fear he'd faced. "So you're staying in Riversbend?" "I'm staying," Blake confirmed. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "But that depends on one other thing." Tessa tilted her head questioningly. "What's that?" Blake reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small ring he'd carried carefully throughout the return journey. Taking a breath that felt inadequate to the significance of the moment, he slowly lowered to one knee before her. "Tessa Grayson," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected given the thundering of his heart. "I spent 11 years believing that the only way to survive out here was to keep moving, to avoid putting down roots that could be torn up by the next storm. Then I saw you feeding stray dogs behind a church, and everything I thought I knew started to unravel." He opened his palm, revealing the pearl ring that caught the last rays of sunlight. "You taught me that what I thought was strength was actually fear. You showed me that real courage isn't facing the frontier alone, it's being willing to build something that matters, even knowing it might not last forever." Tessa's hands had flown to her mouth, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she looked down at him. "I love you," Blake continued, the words that had once seemed impossible now flowing naturally. "I love your kindness, your determination, your willingness to see value where others see only brokenness. I love the future I can imagine with you, and I'm asking if you'll share it with me. Will you marry me, Tessa?" For a moment that stretched into eternity for Blake, she stood silent, tears now spilling freely down her cheeks. Then she nodded, the movement becoming more emphatic as she found her voice. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Blake Oberfield, I will marry you." Blake rose to his feet, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. It fit as though made for her, a small miracle that seemed to confirm the rightness of his decision. As their lips met in a kiss that promised countless more to follow, Blake was vaguely aware of the dogs gathering around them, Thunder pressing against his leg, Ranger nudging Tessa's skirts, the others forming a circle of canine approval that made them both laugh when they finally separated. "Looks like we have their blessing," Tessa observed, her smile radiant through her tears. Blake looked down at the animals that had, improbably, helped lead him to this moment of clarity and commitment. "They knew before I did," he admitted. "The day Thunder chose to trust me, I should have recognized what was happening." Tessa's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Some lessons take longer to learn than others. What matters is that you learned it." As twilight deepened around them, Blake drew her close again, marveling at how completely his life had transformed since that spring day when he'd first seen a compassionate woman feeding creatures others had discarded. In that moment, though he couldn't have recognized it then, his heart had glimpsed possibilities his mind had spent years denying. "I saw you feeding stray dogs," he murmured against her hair, "and realized I wanted a family with you." Tessa leaned back to meet his gaze, her green eyes reflecting all the promise of the future they would build together. "Then that's exactly what we'll create," she assured him. "A family for each other, for these dogs, and someday for children who will learn that love is never wasted, even in the harshest places." As darkness fell completely over River's Bend, Blake Oberfield stood in a yard filled with once-unwanted dogs, holding the woman he loved, finally understanding that the frontier's greatest gift wasn't the freedom of constant movement, but the courage to stay and build something lasting in a world where nothing was guaranteed. He had come home at last,